for attending today. This is Secretary Mnuchin's first hearing since being sworn in as Treasury Secretary in February, and we look forward to our discussion. Many of this committee's priorities fall within the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department, including housing finance reform and development of policies to encourage a healthier economy. We look forward to working with you and your staff on these priorities and improving the lives of Americans. Housing finance reform remains the most significant piece of unfinished business following the crisis, and it is important to build bipartisan support for a path forward. Last week, we received testimony from Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Mel Watt. At that hearing, Director Watt emphasized that it is Congress that needs to act to determine the future of housing finance reform. The hearing reinforced why conservatorship is unsustainable, namely GSEs having zero capital, taxpayers on the hook for losses, and the government effectively taking all risks. A number of groups have released proposals for reform in recent months, including the MBA, the ICBA, the Mnuchin Institute, several co-authors writing jointly for the Urban Institute, and many others. 3 years ago, 7 Republicans and 6 Democrats on this committee voted in support of a comprehensive housing finance reform bill. A key priority of this Congress is to build on that bipartisan legacy and these new ideas and pass legislation that will create a sustainable housing finance system for future generations. I look forward to working with you, Secretary Mnuchin, and your staff at the Treasury Department as this committee develops this bipartisan legislation that will fix the broken housing finance system. Regarding economic growth, I'm encouraged by President Trump's executive order on core principles for regulating the financial system. I understand that the Treasury Department will be issuing a report identifying laws and regulations that inhibit federal regulation of the United States financial system in a manner consistent with the core principles soon. I will review this report and work with you, regulators, and members of the committee to enact measures to improve our financial system. Financial regulation should help ensure a safe and sound financial system, but in a tailored manner to help grow and maintain a healthy economy. We want our nation's banks to be well capitalized and well regulated without being drowned by unnecessary compliance costs. Undue regulation chills innovation and imposes significant and unnecessary costs and burdens on financial institutions and companies, often disproportionately on smaller ones. For example, community banks and credit unions lack the personnel and infrastructure to handle the overwhelming regulatory burden of the past few years, yet in many ways are treated the same as the world's biggest institutions. Our regulatory regime should be properly tailored and avoid a one-size-fits-all approach. One area I would like this committee to address is the $50 billion SIFI threshold for regional banks. In prior hearings, we've discussed whether $50 billion is the appropriate threshold, and I hope that we can work together to craft a more appropriate standard. My goal is to work with you, Secretary Mnuchin, senators of this committee, and financial regulators to look for ways to improve regulation and foster economic growth while maintaining resiliency in the economy. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Nice to see you 2 days in a row. Thank you so much. I thank Chairman Crapo for calling this hearing. Treasury has played a key role in our government since its creation more than 2 centuries ago. That role expanded in the wake of the Great Recession when it became clear at great cost that the rules in place for financial services were inadequate. Given the greater role that the Treasury Secretary plays in oversight of Wall Street, it makes sense that he devote some of his time to conveying his views and those of the administration on issues within this committee's jurisdiction to us and to the public. So far, that communication has been insufficient. Questions posed to the Secretary by me, questions posed to the Secretary by other senators have gone either unanswered or were answered by non-sequiturs. So I hope today will give an opportunity to all of us for more forthright conversations. On Tuesday, we held an ordinary hearing that, in my mind, turned out to be quite extraordinary. 3 of the 4 nominees will work in national security positions in Treasury if confirmed. The 4th will work in a national security position at Commerce. One senator after another felt compelled to ask the nominees, to ask each of them if they would put the law and the Constitution in their country ahead of loyalty to the President. amazing and unprecedented that we thought we had to ask that question. Given all the troubling revelations from the White House and about the White House, such a question is vital for every nominee in a sensitive position. This was hours before we learned that President Trump very likely asked FBI Director Comey to shut down an investigation. Honesty is critical. Our national interests are undermined, whether national security or domestic economic security, when our leaders traffic in falsehoods. You can't lead if we don't believe you. And when I say we, I mean the American public. China was a champion of currency manipulation, and then it wasn't. Wealthy taxpayers would not get a tax cut, and then they would. The deficit would be eliminated in 8 years, and then it wouldn't. Wall Street was getting away with murder, but now it has too big a compliance burden. The carried interest loophole would be closed, but now maybe not. We must invest $1 trillion in our, quote, third world infrastructure, but now there seems to be no rush. No cuts to Medicaid, it was promised. Now a $900 billion cut to Medicaid is fine. The president launched the examination of Dodd-Frank with the claim that credit-worthy borrowers can't get loans. But the spigot isn't dry, and we don't need to, in the president's words, original words perhaps, prime the pump. Bank loans and profits are at record levels. These are facts that bear repeating. Bank loans and profits are at record levels. The president was elected saying Wall Street has caused tremendous problems for us. We're going to tax Wall Street, his words. Now that he's in office, he seems to have forgotten the tremendous problems that Wall Street created for middle-class families across America. That same amnesia seems to have infected a number of my colleagues who seem to forget what Wall Street did 10 years ago to our country, to our economy, to our families, to our neighborhoods. The president sacked a dedicated public servant for a bank lawyer to oversee the nation's biggest banks. He's threatening the Consumer Bureau, one of the only champions that consumers have in the executive branch. Can we improve upon how we regulate the banks and the shadow banks and the rest of the financial services industry? Of course we can. I believe we can do so for smaller institutions, but let's do so based on facts. The fact is that 1 in 5 homeowners in the city of Cleveland, 1 in 5, holds a mortgage that is more than 120% of the value of their home. The fact is that bank lending has grown 6% annually over the past 3 years. Loan growth at community banks was 8% this past year. Lending stalled in the first quarter of this year. Why? Because demand wasn't there. The fact is that U.S. households have more debt now than they did at its peak in 2008, driven by increased auto and student debt. The fact is the wealthiest Americans may have recovered from the Great Recession, recovered and then some, but many, many families like these Cleveland homeowners have not. If we want to improve our economy, we'd be better off debating how to create jobs through an effective means like infrastructure investment rather than the thoroughly discredited trickle-down approach, whether achieved through the tax code or by raising the speed limit for Wall Street. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. And Secretary Mnuchin, we will now turn to you. You have the time that you may need to make a statement. If you would like to introduce anyone as you choose, you may do so. And the time is yours.
Thank you. I would like to introduce my fiancée, Louise Linton, who is with me this morning, as well as many other members of my team at Treasury. Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Brown, and members of the committee, it is an honor to appear before you today for the first time as Treasury Secretary. During my confirmation hearing, I promised to work with Congress to create and maintain prosperity for all Americans. I want to reaffirm that commitment to you today. Let me begin by discussing the Treasury's recent report on foreign exchange policies of our major trading partners. Ensuring that American business, consumers, and workers face a level playing field is one of the essential components of this administration's agenda. When foreign governments engage in currency manipulation, it makes the playing field uneven, which is why we regularly monitor these practices. After careful study, the Treasury Department has found that no major trading partner met the criteria for currency manipulation during the current reporting period. We will continue to follow this important issue and have established a monitoring list of economies that warrant close attention This list comprises China, Germany, Japan, Korea, Switzerland, and Taiwan. Additionally, we are committed to rethinking our foreign agreements and trading practices to ensure they are both free and fair to American business and workers. In my discussions with the IMF and finance ministers of the G20, I have emphasized this goal, and I will continue to do so. Turning to our domestic agenda, it has been more than 30 years since we have had comprehensive tax reform in this country. Combined with often imprudent regulations crafted in the midst of the crisis, the entire American prosperity has slowed. I believe that a goal of 3% GDP or higher economic growth is achievable if we make historic reforms to both taxes and regulation. There are about 100 people working at the Treasury on the issue of tax reform. It is our goal to bring relief to middle-income Americans and make American business competitive again. We will do this all while simplifying the tax system. On regulatory reform, Treasury is preparing its initial report in response to the President's executive order on core principles for regulating the United States financial system. These principles provide a roadmap for the administration's approach to financial services regulation. We have taken a systemic approach in our work by meeting with a variety of stakeholder groups to hear what works, what does not work, and what can be improved. Our initial report contains recommendations to provide relief for community banks and make regulations more efficient, effective, and appropriately tailored. Housing finance reform is another priority of mine. This has been an unresolved issue for far too long, and once we are committed to fixing, we will ensure that there is both ample credit for housing and that we do not put taxpayers at risk. This committee has done extensive work on this, along with your work on community financial institution regulatory relief. My hope is that we can partner on both of these issues. I look forward to working with the Congress to develop a solution. Finally, another area that is crucially important to Treasury is our commitment to combating terrorist activities and financing. We have announced a number of sanctions against individuals and entities associated with destabilizing regimes like Syria, Iran, and North Korea. This work is essential to the administration's efforts to continue to keep Americans safe. The first few months of this administration have been significant. We have been working hard at Treasury to develop and implement policy that will allow the economy to grow. This will make the dream of prosperity once again a reality for all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Mnuchin, and I want to thank you personally for your responsiveness to this committee. We appreciate your willingness to work with us on these issues, and certainly your expertise and assistance can help us get to the right results. I want to take my first question, ask my first question about housing finance reform and the status quo. As I indicated in my opening remarks last week, Director Watt of the FHFA indicated that this was critical for Congress to deal with. My question to you is, do you agree that the status quo is unsustainable and that Congress must move on this issue?
Thank you, Chairman Crapo. I do agree completely with that. We are committed to working with you on a solution on housing reform. I think we need to fix Fannie and Freddie. We are committed to make sure that there is proper liquidity in the housing markets. It's a very, very important part of the American economy, and we need to make sure that there is ample credit for the middle class to buy homes, while at the same time making sure that the taxpayers are not at risk. As you know, the Treasury has a very big line outstanding to those two entities.
Well, thank you. And as you know, during the 113th Congress, this committee developed a comprehensive housing reform bill. We had to make a lot of compromises to achieve that bipartisan legislation. As the committee again focuses on housing finance reform, what do you think are the key compromises that need to be achieved?
Well, I think we're open to working with you, as I've suggested. We need to find a solution that creates necessary liquidity while making sure we don't put taxpayers at risk. And while we've been busy working on tax reform and focusing on regulatory issues, during the second half of this year, I will focus on housing reform and look forward to speaking to many of you on ideas.
Well, one of the big issues that does face us on housing finance reform is whether there should be an explicit government guarantee provided through the housing system. Do you believe that such a guarantee is necessary, and if so, do you think how do we deal with implementing adequate taxpayer protections in exchange for any government guarantee?
Well, I think it's a bit early for me to make a conclusion on whether a guarantee is necessary. That is something that we would like to study very carefully. And if there is a guarantee, we would want to make sure that there is ample credit and real risk in front of that guarantee so that taxpayers are not at risk.
All right, thank you. I want to move quickly to